The Legend of Zelda is one of the most iconic series in all of gaming, and also happens to be my personal favorite. I've set out to rank every main series game and compile the ultimate Zelda series ranking. In this video, we're reviewing The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom. We will be scoring the game across 10 categories. Each category will be scored from 1 to 5, with 5 being the best. Spoilers for the entire game ahead, now let's begin. Tears of the Kingdom takes place a number of years after Breath of the Wild. Link and Zelda explore a cavern beneath Hyrule Castle, which they rightly believe is the source of a substance they call gloom, which has been seeping out and causing people to fall ill. Within the cavern, they find a mural depicting the founding of Hyrule and depicting an event known as the Imprisoning War, an ancient battle against an evil force known as the Demon King. Link and Zelda travel deeper into the cavern and inadvertently cause the awakening of a mummified Ganondorf, who attacks the two with gloom. Link's right arm is badly damaged, the Master Sword is shattered, and Hyrule Castle is raised upwards by the power of Ganondorf. Zelda falls and Link fails to catch her. As she is falling, she vanishes with an object we come to know as a secret stone. Link is rescued by a disembodied arm, which had Ganondorf sealed for thousands of years. Link awakens to find that his wounded arm has been replaced with the formerly disembodied arm. He meets the spirit of Rauru, a Zonai, and the source of Link's new arm. Rauru assists Link through his trials on the Great Sky Island, and upon reaching the pedestal in the Temple of Time, he unknowingly sends the Master Sword back in time. Link then travels back down to the surface of Hyrule, where he learns that the event in the cavern known as the Upheaval has caused chaos all over Hyrule. Link catches up with Purah, who instructs him to investigate reports of strange phenomena throughout the kingdom. In the process, he reunites with Sidon, Tulin, Yunobo, and Revew. And alongside them, Link ventures into ancient Zonai temples where he defeats monsters and finds secret stones. The spirits of sages from ancient times appear to Link and his allies, appointing the latter as sages and passing down the stones, which empower each of them with an element and awakens them as a sage. Afterwards, with reports of Zelda's appearance across Hyrule, Link tracks her down to Hyrule Castle, where she reveals herself to be an imposter serving the Demon King Ganondorf. The imposter Phantom Ganon is then defeated by Link and his allies. Link then sets out to find the final sage needed to help defeat the Demon King. After exploring ancient ruins in the Faron region and suppressing a storm that plagued the Above Sky Island, he happens upon a mask containing the spirit of the sage Minoru. Link transports the mask to the hidden construct factory in the depths to assemble the rest of Minoru's body and then battle alongside Minoru to obtain her secret stone. Through Minoru, the other ancient sages, and dragon tears scattered throughout Hyrule, Link learns of Zelda's fate. With the secret stone she found in the cavern, Zelda was transported through time to the distant past. There she meets Rauru, revealed to be Hyrule's first king, and Sonia, Hyrule's first queen. In the past, Ganondorf kills Sonia, stealing her secret stone and becoming the Demon King. Rauru appoints Minoru, Zelda, and the other unnamed leaders as sages and sacrifices himself to seal Ganondorf. Later, Zelda receives the Master Sword and tasks the sages to aid Link in the future. In order to restore the Master Sword over time and bring it to Link in the present day, she swallows her secret stone and undergoes a process known as draconification, becoming the immortal light dragon. A process which comes at the cost of losing all of your memories and what makes you, you. In the present, after saving the Great Deku Tree from gloom in the Korok Forest, Link retrieves the Master Sword from the Light Dragon and goes to confront Ganondorf below Hyrule Castle. With the aid of the new sages, Link battles an army of monsters before engaging in combat with Ganondorf himself. Nearing defeat, Ganondorf swallows his secret stone and becomes the Demon Dragon, taking Link into the skies above Hyrule. With the assistance of the Light Dragon, Link uses the Master Sword to shatter the Demon Dragon's secret stone, killing him. The spirits of Rauru and Sonia, together with Link, perform a completely unexplained miracle and turn the Light Dragon back into Zelda, and Link conveniently regains his original right arm. Rauru and Sonia fade away, and Link and Zelda fall to the surface below, where they reunite. Sometime later on the Great Sky Island, Minoru bids goodbye to Zelda and Link before fading away while the sages vow to protect Hyrule. As harsh as it may seem, I'm giving this story a 3 out of 5. While Tears of the Kingdom has some of the greatest moments in any Zelda story, they are just that, moments. The lead up and fallout of these great moments just leave a lot to be desired. Ganondorf has an incredible introduction at the beginning of the game, and then he basically does a whole lot of sitting around and waiting for you. While he does send his puppets around, I was hoping for a more active villain in the present time. We also never really learn why he wants to conquer Hyrule, or how he knows so much about the Zonai and Secret Stones. We don't even know why the Secret Stones exist to begin with, for that matter. Princess Zelda turning into a dragon is one of the most surprising and gut-wrenching moments in any Zelda game, but it's hamstrung by the way the story unfolds. Depending on the order in which you view the Dragon Tear memory cutscenes, you could have this moment spoiled to you within the first few hours of the game. Having the memory cutscenes play out in the same order regardless of which geoglyph you go to first would have prevented this issue. Tears of the Kingdom wanted to jam a more linear story into the same non-linear style of Breath of the Wild, and it suffered for it. This on top of Zelda's sacrifice being undone in the most lazy way I could have possibly imagined. To build up this irreversible process called draconification, only to reverse it with no explanation, is just a slap in the face to storytelling. I understand that they couldn't keep Princess Zelda as a dragon because her lineage needs to continue for there to be more games that take place after Tears, but imagine for just a second how much better this game could have been if we ended with the Demon Dragon destroyed and Princess Zelda's sacrifice was justified as Hyrule was saved and Link watches as Princess Zelda flies away into the distance. It would be such a bittersweet ending, and then you could base an entire DLC on Link finding clues on how to reverse the draconification process. So you would have both the somber ending, and then when you change Zelda back, there could be an actual lore-related explanation for it happening. But I guess we know now that's never gonna happen. I say all of this without even getting into the fact that after each temple, we basically get the same exact cutscene for each sage. As great as parts of Tears of the Kingdom's story is, it is easily the most flawed in terms of storytelling for any 3D title. Prior to the release of Tears, many were worried that it wouldn't be as fun to re-explore this version of Hyrule that we had already seen in Breath of the Wild. Thankfully, a post-Calamity and post-upheaval Hyrule is still very much worth the journey. Sometimes revisiting something and seeing how it's changed can be just as fun as discovering something for the first time. Few games give us that opportunity to re-explore a world in a sequel. I remember as a kid playing Banjo-Tooie and trying to see the rest of Gruntilda's lair from the first game. I so badly wanted to see what was still there and what had changed, but unfortunately the game only teases you with a tiny portion of it. World of Warcraft may be the most famous example prior to Tears, with the expansion Cataclysm, where nearly the entire map of Azeroth had changed following the attack of Deathwing. Now Tears of the Kingdom can be added to that conversation, about how sometimes recycling a previous game's map and making changes can very much work in a game's favor. Going beyond just the surface of Hyrule, we have plenty of sky islands to explore as well. While no island is ever as expansive as the Great Sky Island we start on, there are quite a few big ones to discover. Though the Sky Islands are probably the most disappointing part of the map to explore. They were marketed heavily as the main attraction, but the majority of them are copy-pasted all around the sky. Once you understand the purpose of each Sky Island variation, there isn't much left that feels fresh. The depths was a major surprise for most players, an entire underworld the size of Hyrule's surface, just waiting to be explored. The whole map starts out completely dark, and it's up to the player to light it with bright bloom seeds and by discovering light roots. The depths admittedly get a little too repetitive and samey, but given that it feels like icing on the cake of an already expansive world, it is forgivable. Lastly, Tears added caves, which are probably my favorite addition. Each cave will at least have a bubble frog waiting at the end, but a good amount of them lead to a shrine as well. And the caves have some variations in theming depending on which region you're in. Admittedly, caves had a lot more potential than Tears delivered on. They could have added a unique boss or a cool reward at the end, but most were still fun to explore anyway. The world for Tears of the Kingdom gets a 5 out of 5. How Hyrule was able to be expanded on from Breath of the Wild is nothing short of amazing. Making the surface fun to explore and adding the sky, depths, and caves make the game's map almost too overwhelming for most players. While it's certainly not perfect, given that Hyrule's surface is still far and away the most interesting place to explore, with the depths and sky islands feeling a bit lacking, it's still hard not to give this world a score of a 5. This game obviously shares the same art style as Breath of the Wild, which works perfectly well given that it's a direct sequel. The same beautiful Hyrule and character designs are featured, with wholly new areas to explore. The biggest change to the art direction, aside from the additions of the depths and sky islands, is the replacement of all Sheikah aesthetics with that of the Zonai. The Zonai green and dragon visuals are everywhere you turn in this post-upheaval Hyrule. I much prefer the Zonai aesthetic over the Sheikah one, so that's definitely a bonus in my book. The art style gets a 5 out of 5. Much like Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom is a fantastic looking game and has its own distinct feel thanks to the Zonai aesthetic. While the depths and Sky Islands could have a bit more going on to them and more visual distinction, there is still so many moments in this game that are stunning due to the game's visual presentation. While not technically items, much like my Breath of the Wild review, I'm counting the 4 core abilities as items. Ultra Hand is perhaps the most important ability in the game, and it lets you interact with nearly any object. You can move and rotate the object and attach it to other objects. This creates a nearly limitless amount of options for creating vehicles and other various structures to solve puzzles and get around the map. Fuse is similar to Ultra Hand, but is limited to weapons. You can fuse almost any object to a base weapon to change its attributes and increase its strength. You can fuse objects to your arrows as well that make for different abilities. Fusing Electric Chew Jelly will make shock arrows, and a Key's-Eye will make it a homing arrow. Ascend lets you warp through the ceiling of any landmass or floating island to bring you to the top of said structure. Recall lets you rewind a specific object's motion back in time. Later on in the game, if you happen to find it, there is also the auto build function, which lets you make previous builds faster. These 4 abilities, when harnessed with each other, can feel incredibly powerful. For instance, you can use Ultra Hand to move a platform up into the air and set it back down, then climb on it yourself and use Recall to make it a DIY elevator. You can also ascend through some structures you make yourself with Ultra Hand. Fuse is a little more standalone, but it still has some amazing use cases besides just creating powerful weapons, such as fusing a minecart to your shield to make a skateboard. When it comes to weapons, it's a little bit harder to rate than Breath of the Wild, because you'll be making a lot of them yourself instead of just picking them up from a defeated enemy. There is a near infinite amount of combinations for weapons, many of which have specific niche times when they are best. You'll likely find a few set combinations for the basic strong weapons, but there will always be scenarios where you might want an elemental weapon instead. Tears adds some new gear for Link on his adventure and also adds in some of the DLC gear from Breath of the Wild. I won't get into the lore implications of the DLC gear, but I will say it does come off as a bit lazy instead of adding more unique gear to the game. My biggest gripe with the gear is that it does feel like it takes too long to upgrade, and most will only probably upgrade 1 or 2 sets they like, since the benefits of the other gear won't be worth the cost to upgrade. The fact that you can work so hard to do a Lucky Gazette side quest only for the frog suit to not be fully slip resistant until you upgrade it 2 times just feels really bad, as it was a solution to one of the biggest complaints from the previous game. The Sage abilities, which are granted for each temple completion, are definitely a step down from Breath of the Wild's abilities. You'll get a water shield from Sidon, Yunobo will charge forward like a cannonball to break rocks or hit enemies, Revew will strike lightning wherever you shoot your arrow, and Tulin will shoot a gust of wind to help you propel forward while gliding. Minoru is also there as a giant mech companion. The abilities are all a bit more niche with the exception of Tulin, who I found myself using nearly every time I was gliding. Items get a 5 out of 5. While Sage abilities aren't as cool as Breath of the Wild and much of the gear is not worth upgrading, Tears of the Kingdom still does a lot with its items. Monster parts that were borderline useless in Breath of the Wild now add new abilities and strength to your arsenal, making monster camps actually worth taking out this time around. Fuse makes it possible to have so many weapon combinations, you'll still be finding new ones right up until the very end of your playthrough. The 4 core abilities are extremely fun to use, especially when figuring out how to get them to work together. That feeling you had of breaking the game in Breath of the Wild is taken to the next level in Tears. The gameplay and combat mechanics are completely carried over from Breath of the Wild, with a few new additions. One of those is being able to glide and control your movement while flying through the air and controlling vehicles. The new abilities Link has are what enhance the gameplay. Fuse and Ultra Hand give you more choice in terms of how you want to approach a given situation, at the cost of speed and fluidity, which to me was the biggest adjustment from Breath of the Wild to Tears of the Kingdom. Ultra Hand, while exponentially more sophisticated than an ability like Magnesis, also takes a lot more time to achieve the solution to whatever puzzle you want to solve, especially in the beginning of the game while you're still getting used to the controls. Having to rebuild or alter a structure after not correctly solving a puzzle takes up a lot more time than simply rearranging a metal object or two. This is a similar case with Fuse and how it functions during combat. In Breath of the Wild, the weapons were fragile, sure, but you could immediately pick up a new one mid-fight and be ready to go, which is not always the case in Tears of the Kingdom. A lot of times you have to consciously stop and take a moment to fuse a bunch of weapons, which breaks the flow of the gameplay. Fusing a weapon in the middle of combat is an option, but is always less than ideal, and it's very easy to fuse the wrong item to your weapon when under duress. Combat already had issues with its flow in Breath of the Wild when you had to pause the game to heal, which shockingly was not addressed at all in Tears of the Kingdom. Now, on top of that, fusing an item to your arrow adds yet another interruption to combat, as you have to scroll through all of your items to find which one you want to fuse with. Sure, you can sort by most used, but anytime you want something for a unique situation, it's a chore scrolling through everything. I won't spend too much time on the Sage abilities and how you activate them, as it's a total disaster and it's been covered to death by many other channels. So I'll just echo everyone else's opinion that having to actually run up to each Sage Spirit to use them was a major mistake. If I was up against a particular boss where I needed a specific ability, I nearly always dismissed all other Sages And even then, it was still hard to sometimes find the sage and activate the ability. Now, despite all the issues I have with the gameplay in Tears, I will still very much say it is a net positive over Breath of the Wild's gameplay. Creating my own weapons, structures, vehicles made the game more my own and opens up the world and encounters to be conquered in a near infinite amount of ways. I found shrine puzzles to be a lot more fun because the intended solution seemed less obvious than Breath of the Wild's puzzles, so it usually made me feel more accomplished for finding a way to solve something. Nintendo did a great job with how all your resources interact with each other, incentivizing you to play each layer of the map. You want to explore the caves on the surface for bright bloom seeds to help you explore the depths. The depths has a ton of zonite for your zonite devices and helps expand your battery to explore the sky. The sky provides sundelions, which helps combat the gloom in the depths. Speaking of gloom, this substance takes away from your total health pool temporarily, which can be healed by going to the surface or finding a light route. If you need to recover in a pinch though, the Sundelion food will do so. Gameplay gets a 5 out of 5. While certainly not perfect, Tears of the Kingdom brings the most creative gameplay to a Zelda game to date. While I'd love for Nintendo and future games to address the amount of pausing and menu scrolling that interrupts the flow of gameplay, I can't deny that it was still a considerable step up from the previous game. Going into this game, one of the most requested elements from fans was to see more traditional style dungeons akin to that of Ocarina of Time or Twilight Princess. And while dungeons were an improvement, I would consider them a half step forward. Each temple at least now has its own unique theming and layout. The build up to each dungeon is also a major improvement, with some dungeon build-ups being better than some of the actual dungeons. While you can do dungeons in any order, the first dungeon most people will probably do is the Wind Temple. The Wind Temple has a great build-up, working your way up to the storm and jumping right through the eye of it. As soon as the dungeon started though, and you got the first objective, my heart sank as I realized I was playing a glorified divine beast. The dungeon has some decent puzzles, and again the theming is a step up, but I can't help but feel all these temples still feel a bit empty, and 90% of the time the enemies are just constructs. The Fire Temple has the most complex layout of all the temples, and has some legitimately challenging puzzles. The dungeon is also extremely cheesable if you're into that sort of thing. I mean, every dungeon can be cheesed in some way, but the Fire Temple especially, because the main puzzle of each gong was about finding the path to get to it, while the other dungeons maybe had some more puzzles blocking the actual objective. So using Ascend or making a Zonai device can trivialize this entire dungeon. The Water Temple had a few good puzzles involving low gravity and bubbles of water. The puzzles themselves are fine. The big disappointment is the layout and theming. This dungeon is just 4 sky islands, and the theming just doesn't scream Zora to me. It also feels off that the Zora dungeon is in the sky. I mentioned it before in a previous video, but the Zora waterworks should have been expanded into the actual dungeon. The Lightning Temple is easily the best dungeon in Tears. The Ancient Tomb theming fits with the Gerudo Desert, and it has the best layout. The main gimmick, besides having its own unique enemy, the Gibdo, was using mirrors to reflect light, which was a nice callback to the Spirit Temple from Ocarina of Time. Speaking of comparing this temple to Ocarina of Time, as a quick aside, don't these places just feel more empty than games from nearly 3 decades ago? Either I'm crazy or the N64 games did a better job of making these places feel more real and lived in. At the very least, to me, they look more visually appealing. The Construct Factory, which leads to the Spirit Temple, is the final dungeon of the game. Located in the depths, you have to assemble the construct for Mineru's spirit to have a body. I enjoy having to think creatively with the Zonai devices here, and I liked that the 4 objectives were actual pieces of Mineru's construct, as opposed to just random terminals that had to be activated. The goal felt a lot more tangible than the others. Hyrule Castle and the path to Ganondorf aren't really proper dungeons, so it's tough to count them in this category, and there's no real puzzles involved either, it's just about taking on hordes of enemies. Dungeons get a 1 out of 5. I know this will seem harsh to many, as I also gave Breath of the Wild a 1 for its dungeons, but I'm willing to die on this hill. The dungeons and tiers are an improvement, but they are still the worst part about this game. For reference, I gave Wind Waker's dungeons the score of a 2, due to the low amount of dungeons and the fact that they were all good, but not great. I would take any one dungeon from Wind Waker over any one dungeon from Tears, so I hope that demonstrates the gap in quality. The open air design of this game is great for a lot of things, but after Breath and Tears, I feel it's safe to say that it just doesn't work for full-fledged dungeons. Tears of the Kingdom brings a few new enemies to the table, among them constructs, boss bokoblins, like-likes, and horriblins. While this does add some much needed variety to Breath of the Wild's roster of enemies, it still becomes stale and predictable after several hours. You'll eventually learn where you'll find each enemy and nothing will surprise you anymore. Like how the Wind Temple enemies being constructs and the Fire Temple enemies are just constructs and the Water Temple enemies are just constructs and the Lightning Temple enemies are just, oh hey, wait, we actually have Gibdos on this one too. Some really cool enemies I was looking forward to facing after watching them in the trailer, like the Arrokuda, literally just die to one arrow. What was even the point of adding this thing if it's no stronger than a Keese? Thankfully though, bosses were an improvement. All the world bosses are back with a few new additions. The Flux Construct is a really cool boss fight that is very open-ended in how you want to fight it. Any of your abilities can be used. Use Ultra Hand to pull it apart or Recall to get up to it when it's high in the air. I appreciate all the different approaches you can take, even though this enemy does get spammed a lot across the map quite a bit. The Frox is a boss you'll only find in the depths and is the least exciting new boss. It's pretty much a Hinox and a Stone Talus combined, and I just found these guys very boring to fight. Gleeoks were one of the best boss additions to Tears of the Kingdom. They are incredibly intimidating and something I avoided at all costs until the end of the game when I was prepared to take them on. There is a version of each element and my mind was blown when I came across the King Gleeok variant, which has a head for frost, fire, and lightning. On top of that, there's a gloom version of the King Gleeok. These enemies were incredibly fun to fight. Even more terrifying is the Gloom Hands. Tears of the Kingdom needed an enemy to replace those Guardian Stalkers, and they succeeded with the Gloom Hands. The only way I know how to take these out is to spam bomb arrows until they die. If anyone has actually been able to successfully melee these things, please let me know. Your reward for defeating them? Phantom Ganon, of course. Thankfully, he's actually much easier to fight, but also an enjoyable one and a great reminder that Ganon's presence is lurking around Hyrule, at least in some way. In the depths, you'll encounter Master Koga several times at larger mines. I love that after knocking Koga down into the depths, he has taken it upon himself to stay down there and try to master Zonai vehicle construction. Each battle with Koga is a great mix of hilarity and fun. To see a Zelda boss operating a monster truck vehicle is just the right kind of absurdity for me. The dungeon bosses are a major step up from the Blight Ganons from Breath of the Wild. Colgera is the Wind Temple boss and is probably my favorite boss in the entire game. It has an epic music track that goes along with the fight that calls back to Mulgera from Wind Waker and the Rito Village theme. It's so much fun gliding through the air and crashing right through Colgera's body. Many have complained that the fight is too easy, but given that it's intended to be the first temple boss, I really don't have any issue with it, and I also don't care if a boss is easy if I'm having fun. Marbled Goma is probably the weakest temple boss, in which you use Yunobo's ability to knock down 2 of its legs and then attack the eyeball. While not incredibly exciting, I still appreciate the return to form with the boss design. Muktarok is the boss that annoyed me the most, but that's mostly because I ran out of arrows. Older Zelda games used to be very good about providing drops for useful items against a boss, but I guess since you don't need the arrows to beat Muktarok, they didn't provide them, which made for a slow and agonizing boss fight where I had to slowly chip away at him as he bounced around the arena. Queen Gibdo is an intense fight with hordes of Gibdos constantly crawling at you. The toughest part is finding Riju to get the lightning ability to take out all of the hives. Also making sure the radius of the lightning strike completely covers the hive is a must, because too many times did I think I was destroying a hive only for it to miss. Hyrule Castle has you face off against multiple Phantom Ganons, and thankfully the sages are there to help you as well. The Phantom Ganons play pretty much how they do as overworld bosses, but the fight still makes for a fun set piece. The Seas construct is another polarizing battle, but as a wrestling fan I found it pretty fun to participate in a WrestleMania style mech battle. It's pretty easy, but again, the absurdity of something like this in a Zelda game is just too good. The final showdown in Tears of the Kingdom comes against the Demon King Ganondorf. It's in the running to be one of the best Ganondorf fights in the series. Not saying his character is on the same level as Wind Waker or Twilight Princess, but the fight is definitely epic. A multi-phase battle one-on-one, multiple Ganons, sages, and his health meter that just doesn't stop growing. Then to cap it off with an incredible finale where Ganondorf gets so fed up, he turns into a freaking dragon. It's just the perfect way to go out. Even though the dragon phase is easy, much like Dark Beast Ganon was in Breath, it's done in a much better way. It's beautiful, cinematic, and what a way to go out with Dragon Zelda coming to your aid to finally end the conflict. Bosses and enemies get a 4 out of 5. The addition to some new enemies helped improve the monotonous repetition of fighting the same enemies that we saw in Breath of the Wild, but the biggest improvement came from bosses that were way more cinematic and fun. This is where Tears of the Kingdom went back to traditional Zelda roots, and it played great dividends. Side content takes a step up this time around. The quest log added a new category known as side adventures for longer side quests, of which there are many. Many of the quests themselves are more closely tied to the main narrative as well, dealing with the upheaval and or trying to figure out what happened to Princess Zelda. The Lucky Clover Gazette is one of the more involved quests that has you going to every stable to investigate a strange occurrence that might involve Princess Zelda. Finishing the quest actually has a good reward too with the frog suit, even if you do need to upgrade it as I complained about earlier. Hateno Village has a fun quest involving a mayoral election. As with Breath of the Wild, I also include shrines in this section, and shrines take a big step up for several reasons. The abilities, particularly Ultra Hand, make for more creative solutions for many of the shrines, which I think made them more fun to complete. I also appreciate that they added new shrines that take away all of your items like Eventide Island did in the previous game. The Sky Islands involve many shrine puzzles themselves, which are mostly good but do get repetitive. While I would have preferred a bigger shakeup to the gameplay loop in Tears, I can't deny that the shrines themselves are better overall in this game. Korok Seeds are also back, and other than the addition of quests to bring a Korok to his friend, there really isn't too much to add. Once I found out the reward was exactly the same for getting all the Koroks, I knew I had no reason to care about them once I felt I had an adequate amount of item slots. Side content gets a 5 out of 5. The introduction of more involved quests, also known as side adventures, and more immersive quests that complement the main narrative make for more enjoyable content. The rewards for side content is still not great for most quests. Your motivation for doing them is usually just for the fun of doing them. Fans of these games are also so desperate for unique rewards that a quest reward that simply lets Link put his hood down starts to sound like the most hype thing ever. After 19 mainline games and so many iconic tracks, Zelda music has reached such a high standard that it's nearly impossible for a game to come in and topple one of the greatest OSTs, such as Ocarina of Time or Wind Waker. Tears of the Kingdom brings some bangers to the table, but I can't say the soundtrack comes close to being one of my favorites. Much like Majora's Mask before it, being a direct sequel, Tears borrows a lot of music from Breath of the Wild. This does hurt the game in having its own audio identity. For example, when visiting Rito Village, it's covered in snow and has a more somber version of the Rito Village theme. I thought this was an amazing touch. I was, however, disappointed that once you saved the village after completing the Wind Temple, the music was then identical to that of Breath of the Wild. I really wish they went out of their way to make the music sound more different, because you will most likely hear the Breath of the Wild version more in your playthrough, assuming you save the village relatively early. Being a Zelda game though, the music is still incredible otherwise. Lookout Landing is a certified classic and add me to the list of people who popped off when they first heard Colgera's theme. The music gets a 3 out of 5. Tears of the Kingdom has a solid soundtrack that borrows a bit too much from Breath of the Wild for my liking. There is still a ton of fantastic new music in the game to enjoy, and what's new is expertly crafted. I think Majora's Mask was able to handle a similar situation a bit better when it came to recycling the music, but to be fair, the older games had music much more forward and noticeable. Again, the music standard is incredibly high, and admittedly a lot of older games have nostalgia on their side. Who knows, in time my appreciation for the music in this game could grow even more. Much like Breath of the Wild, once the tutorial is complete, you can go anywhere and do anything. You are free to go right to the final boss if you choose to do so, though they don't make Ganondorf's whereabouts as obvious as they did Calamity Ganon, even though Ganondorf is basically exactly where you last saw him. So given the immense freedom Tears embraces, one would expect that I score this section a 5 much like I did Breath of the Wild, but I don't think it quite gets there. I'm giving the pacing and progression for Tears of the Kingdom a 4 out of 5. It's still incredibly solid, but I think there's a few bumps along the road. First of all, it's a little baffling how the game holds out on giving you the paraglider as long as it does. I get it for the tutorial islands, but they drag it out a bit too much once you land on Hyrule. I also have to bring in how clunky the story can unfold if you happen to get the memories in a weird order. This was not at all a problem in Breath of the Wild, as the order of the memories were not unfolding a story we didn't already know the conclusion to. I already addressed this point earlier, I know, but story progression is a major piece of this category. I also add on the incredibly repetitive cutscenes after the completion of each temple, as we are told virtually the same story of the imprisoning war multiple times. Another factor in play is based on when you discover there is a fake Zelda causing havoc in Hyrule. Depending on how you play, you can discover this somewhat early on and have dozens of immersion-breaking moments where Link clearly knows the Zelda every NPC is talking about is a puppet of Ganondorf's, but just plays along with everyone for no apparent reason. Tears of the Kingdom's choice of a more linear story certainly came back to bite them when they also wanted to retain the exact same formula as Breath of the Wild. While I may come across more critical than most reviews, I still had a blast with Tears of the Kingdom and believe it is a great game. As much as I love to complain, I still easily sunk in over 120 hours without much hesitation. I would not have done that had I not been having fun. My frustration comes from the fact that I believe the game could have been so much more, but that's a conversation for another day. By the way, I do also reserve the right to change the game's score if the game happens to get DLC, though with recent news that seems unlikely. So we've gone through every category, and here is the recap of the scores. This averages out to a 4.0 out of 5. We covered several other Zelda games including Breath of the Wild, Minish Cap, and Twilight Princess in previous videos, so here is where we stand with all of the games. As we rate each game, we will continue to populate this list and build the ultimate Zelda series ranking.